They were driving down a dark New Hampshire road when a light appeared in the sky that made them pull over in terror. What happened next would change their lives forever and become one of the most documented alien encounter cases in American history. It was September 19, 1961, a warm Tuesday evening, and Sarah and David Morgan were returning home to Portsmouth after a wonderful week-long vacation in Montreal. Sarah was a nurse at the local hospital, a calm and rational woman of 42 who never believed in the supernatural. David was a postal worker, 45 years old, a Korean War veteran with a strong character and practical outlook on life. They were an ordinary mid-century American couple, hard-working, honest, far from fantasy. That evening they were driving south on Route 3, enjoying the last hours of their trip, when Sarah first noticed a strange light in the sky just above the tree line. At first she thought it was a falling star or an airplane heading to Portsmouth Airport, but the light wasn't moving in a predictable trajectory. It seemed to dance in the night sky, rising up then dropping down sharply, making impossible turns that no known aircraft of that time could perform. David didn't pay attention to his wife's words at first, focusing on the road, but when Sarah insistently pointed out the window, he took a quick glance and frowned. The light was indeed behaving strangely. It was bright, almost blinding, with a slight amber tint that seemed unnatural against the black September sky. David slowed down, trying to understand what it could be, running through logical explanations in his mind. Military exercises at Peace Air Force Base, a Coast Guard helicopter, maybe even a weather balloon, though it was moving too fast and unpredictably for a balloon. They continued driving, but the light didn't disappear. Moreover, it seemed to follow their car, maintaining the same distance above the forest to the right of the highway. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, though it was warm in the car. David gripped the steering wheel tighter, his military training forcing him to stay calm, but inside grew an anxiety he couldn't explain. They passed Lake Winnipesaukee, and the light was still there. Now it seemed closer, descended lower, as if deliberately wanting to attract their attention. Near the town of Indian Head, David decided to stop at a roadside picnic area to get a better look at the object. He turned off the engine, and they both got out of the car into the cool night air filled with the smell of pines and damp earth. The silence was absolute. Even the cicadas had fallen quiet, which seemed particularly strange to Sarah. David took binoculars from the trunk that they had brought along for bird watching in Canada and pointed them at the sky. What he saw made his blood run cold. This was not an airplane, not a helicopter, not anything he had ever seen in his life. The object was disc-shaped, massive, perhaps 30 meters in diameter, with a row of bright lights around the perimeter that pulsed in a strange rhythm. Through the binoculars, David could make out what looked like windows or portholes, and behind one of them, he would swear to it, he saw figures, silhouettes of something or someone looking down directly at him. His hands trembled. He passed the binoculars to Sarah, who looked and gasped quietly, dropping the binoculars to the ground. The object suddenly began to descend, moving straight toward them without a single sound, which was completely impossible for any aircraft of that size. David grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her back to the car, his instinct screaming danger, though he couldn't understand why. They jumped into the car. David turned the ignition key, but the engine didn't start on the first try, which intensified the panic. On the second attempt, the motor roared, and David pressed the gas, pulling out of the area back onto the highway. The object was now hovering directly over the road ahead of them, at a height of no more than 30 meters, blocking the way with its huge metallic body. The light from it was so bright that David could barely see the road. He instinctively jerked the wheel to the right, trying to go around this impossible obstacle. But the car skidded on grass wet from evening dew, and they crashed into a roadside tree with a dull thud that shattered a headlight and bent the bumper. The impact wasn't strong, but enough to shake them both, the seatbelts digging into their shoulders. David raised his head, expecting to see the object right above them. But the sky was empty. The light had disappeared as if it had never been there. Around them stood ordinary night silence again. Even the cicadas had resumed their song. Sarah was breathing heavily, her hands trembling as she tried to unbuckle her seatbelt. David looked at the clock on the dashboard and froze. It showed 2 in the morning. But that was impossible. When they stopped at the picnic area, it was about 10 in the evening. How could they have lost 4 hours of time? David checked his wristwatch. It showed the same thing. Sarah looked at her watch and turned pale. 4 hours of their lives had simply disappeared, dissolved into the night without a trace, without memories, as if someone had cut that piece of time out of their existence. They sat in the damaged car by the road, trying to understand what had happened, but their minds refused to provide answers. David finally started the car again. It worked, despite the dented bumper, and they slowly drove home, not saying a word the entire remaining drive. When they arrived in Portsmouth at 4 in the morning, both felt exhausted, as if they hadn't slept for several days in a row. David took the car to the garage, noticing strange circular marks on the hood that definitely weren't there before the trip, as if someone had placed several large magnets on the metal, and they left traces. In the house, Sarah immediately took a shower, feeling an overwhelming need to wash off something invisible, some sense of contamination she couldn't explain. David discovered that his boots were heavily scuffed, as if he had been walking for hours on a rough surface, though he didn't remember getting out of the car after they returned to the road after hitting the tree. Sarah's dress had small tears and strange stains that wouldn't wash out. They went to bed as dawn was breaking, but sleep brought no rest. Both were tormented by fragments of nightmares: bright light, a metal table, strange faces with huge dark eyes. But upon waking, they couldn't remember details, only a feeling of terror and helplessness. The following days passed in a fog. David returned to work, delivering mail on familiar routes, but his mind constantly returned to that night. Sarah tried to focus on her duties at the hospital, but caught herself freezing in the middle of a ward, staring into emptiness, trying to remember those lost 4 hours. They didn't tell anyone about what happened for the first weeks, fearing they would be considered crazy or attention-seeking fabricators. But the silence was agonizing. The mystery was eating away at them from inside, especially at night when the nightmares became brighter and more intrusive. Sarah began seeing in dreams a sterile room with bright light directed straight into her eyes, cold touches on her skin, voices without words that penetrated directly into her mind. David saw beings, short in stature, with disproportionately large heads, and eyes that looked at him without emotion, studying him like a specimen in a laboratory. These dreams were too vivid, too consistent to be simple nightmares. They felt like memories breaking through some block in their consciousness. A month after the incident, Sarah couldn't take it anymore and told her older sister Margaret, who lived in Boston, about what had happened. Margaret was a skeptic by nature, worked as an accountant, and believed only in what could be counted and written in a book. But even she couldn't ignore her younger sister's obvious distress. She suggested Sarah see a psychiatrist, not because she thought her sick, but because 4 lost hours and constant nightmares clearly needed professional help. Sarah discussed this with David, and after much doubt, they decided to contact Dr. Benjamin Simon, a renowned Boston psychiatrist and hypnosis specialist. Dr. Simon was a respected professional with an impeccable reputation, a man of science who took his work with absolute seriousness. When Sarah and David first met with him, in his office on Beacon Street in December 1961, he listened to their story with polite interest, making notes in his pad. Dr. Simon didn't mock them, didn't call them phantasms, but also didn't express immediate belief in alien abduction. He proposed a series of regressive hypnosis sessions to try to restore the lost memories and understand the nature of their nightmares. The first session took place in January 1962. Dr. Simon began with David, putting him into a deep hypnotic state in the quiet setting of his office, where heavy curtains blocked street noise, and the only sound was the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Under hypnosis, David returned to that night. His voice became quieter, almost childlike, as he began describing events after they returned to the car from the picnic area. He said the object descended so low that it hovered directly above the hood of their car, emitting a pulsating light that penetrated through the windshield. David felt a strange numbness spreading through his body, starting from his feet and moving upward, depriving him of control over his own muscles. He tried to scream, warn Sarah, but his voice wouldn't obey. The next thing he remembered was the car door opening by itself, though he definitely didn't touch the handle. Figures emerged from the bright light, short, about 120 centimeters tall, with gray skin and large, pear-shaped heads. Their eyes were huge, black, almond-shaped, occupying half their faces, without visible pupils or irises, just bottomless darkness in which light reflected. They had small openings instead of a nose, barely noticeable, and a thin line of a mouth without lips. Their bodies looked fragile, with long, thin arms and legs. Fingers were long, possibly 4 or 5 on each hand. David couldn't remember exactly under hypnosis. They approached the car, moving strangely smoothly, as if gliding rather than stepping. David felt his body rising from the driver's seat without his will, as if an invisible force controlled his muscles. He heard Sarah quietly sobbing nearby, but couldn't turn his head to look at her. They took samples, skin scrapings, possibly hair. David wasn't sure. Everything happened in a fog of confusion and fear. The strangest thing was that the beings seemed to communicate without words, their thoughts penetrating directly into his mind, not through ears, but through some kind of direct mental contact. He didn't hear voices in the traditional sense, but knew what they wanted, that he should remain calm, that they weren't going to harm him, that this was just research. But their version of not causing harm included procedures that caused discomfort and humiliation, a feeling of complete helplessness before a more advanced intelligence. Time in that room flowed strangely. David couldn't say whether minutes or hours had passed. Everything merged into one long moment of bright light and cold touches. Then, as suddenly as it all began, they led him back along the same glowing beam, returning him to the car. The last thing he remembered was sitting behind the wheel, the object rapidly rising into the sky and disappearing behind the trees at a speed that defied physics. The car engine was working again, though David didn't remember turning the key, and they just drove, silently, in shock, until they got home. Dr. Simon brought David out of hypnosis, and the man opened his eyes, his face wet with tears he didn't remember shedding. The next session was with Sarah, and her memories restored under hypnosis were terrifyingly similar to David's account, though they discussed their sessions with Dr. Simon separately to avoid mutual influence. Sarah remembered the same room, the same bright light, the same beings with huge dark eyes. She was also placed on a table, and the procedures she underwent were more invasive and personal, which made her cry even under hypnosis. The beings were particularly interested in her reproductive system. They performed some procedure that caused pain and fear. Sarah remembered one being that seemed different from the others, perhaps their leader, who stood near her head and projected calming thoughts, trying to reduce her panic. This being showed her images that appeared directly in her mind, like three-dimensional holograms, star maps, planets, places she couldn't identify, perhaps their home world or destination. These images were so alien that her brain refused to fully process them, leaving only a vague sense of vast distances and unfamiliar constellations. If you're still listening to this incredible story of Sarah and David Morgan, I ask you to subscribe to the channel because there are many more amazing and mysterious stories from the past ahead that changed ordinary people's lives and remain unexplained to this day. And your support helps us continue exploring these forgotten cases and sharing them with you. The sessions with Dr. Simon continued for several months, each session revealing new details of that night, assembling a mosaic from fragments of suppressed memories. Dr. Simon was puzzled. His scientific mind sought rational explanations, false memories, suggestion, collective hallucination. But the consistency and detail of both spouses' accounts, obtained independently of each other, challenged simple explanations. He couldn't find signs of psychosis or schizophrenia. Sarah and David were mentally healthy people who sincerely believed in the reality of their experience. Moreover, physical evidence couldn't be ignored. The scuffs on David's boots, the tears on Sarah's dress, the circular marks on the car hood, 4 lost hours that both couldn't explain. Dr. Simon wrote a detailed case report that later became the basis for a book, though he himself didn't draw final conclusions about the nature of what happened, leaving the question open for interpretation. The story of Sarah and David Morgan began seeping into public space in the mid-1960s, first as rumors and newspaper notes in local New Hampshire publications. Journalist John Fuller heard about their case and became interested. He conducted a series of interviews with the couple and Dr. Simon, obtaining permission to publish their story. In 1966, the book The Interrupted Journey came out, which became a sensation, selling millions of copies throughout America and beyond. Public reaction was divided. Some believed every word, seeing in the Morgan story proof of the existence of extraterrestrial life and its interest in humanity. Others considered it a hoax or the result of psychological problems. Skeptics pointed to the popularity of science fiction in the 60s, to recent releases of films and books about aliens, claiming that Sarah and David could have unconsciously constructed their memories based on cultural images of that time. But defenders of their story pointed to details that didn't match popular depictions of aliens in mass culture of those years, to the consistency of their accounts under hypnosis, to the absence of any motive for fabrication. Sarah and David gained nothing from their story except public attention that was often unwelcome and skepticism that hurt them deeply.
They didn't seek fame or money. They simply wanted answers to what happened to them on that September night. The case attracted the attention of ufologists and researchers from around the world. The star map that Sarah drew under hypnosis, allegedly shown to her by the leader of the beings, became the subject of intense study. In 1968, an amateur astronomer named Marjorie Fish spent years creating 3-dimensional models of nearby star systems, trying to match Sarah's map to actual stellar configurations. Fish claimed she found a match. The map corresponded to the view from the Zeta Reticuli star system, a binary star system about 39 light-years from Earth. This discovery gave the case its second name, the Zeta Reticuli incident. Critics argued that Fish's interpretation was subjective, that she could have found patterns where none existed, a phenomenon known as apophenia. But supporters pointed out that Sarah and David drew the map years before Fish's analysis, that she had no astronomical knowledge that would allow her to fabricate such a detailed star chart. The debate continues to this day, with no definitive proof either way. The Morgan case, as it came to be known in ufology circles, became the template for subsequent alien abduction reports. The description of the beings, short, gray skin with large black eyes, thin bodies, and advanced technology, became the standard image of extraterrestrials in popular culture, often called grays. Before the Morgan case, aliens in science fiction and reported sightings varied widely in appearance, from human-like to monstrous. After their story became public, reports of similar beings increased dramatically, leading skeptics to argue this proved the power of suggestion and cultural contamination of memories. But believers countered that perhaps Sarah and David were simply the first to break the silence, encouraging others who had similar experiences to come forward without fear of ridicule. The psychological impact on Sarah and David was profound and lasting. Despite Dr. Simon's treatment and the passage of time, they never fully recovered from the trauma of that night. Sarah became involved with ufology groups, attending conferences and speaking at events, trying to find others with similar experiences and seeking validation for what they endured. David became more withdrawn, the attention and skepticism taking a toll on his mental health. He suffered from depression and anxiety for years. The nightmares never fully stopped, though they became less frequent over time. Their marriage survived the ordeal, strengthened by shared trauma and the knowledge that they were the only ones who truly understood what the other had experienced. They remained together until David's death in 1969 from a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 46, possibly stress-related according to some who knew him. Sarah lived much longer, continuing to advocate for recognition of the abduction phenomenon and supporting other experiencers who came forward with their own stories. She gave numerous interviews, participated in documentaries, and maintained that everything she and David reported was absolutely true, not fabrication or delusion. Sarah passed away in 2004 at the age of 85, taking with her any final secrets of that September night that might have remained locked in her memory. The legacy of the Morgan case extends far beyond their personal story. It opened the door to serious discussion of alien abduction as a phenomenon worthy of study, not just dismissal as fantasy or mental illness. Researchers like Dr. John Mack, a Harvard psychiatrist who later studied abduction experiences, credited cases like the Morgans with demonstrating that experiencers were often credible, psychologically healthy individuals whose accounts deserved careful consideration. The case also highlighted the limitations of hypnotic regression as a tool for recovering accurate memories, as subsequent research showed that hypnosis can create false memories as easily as it recovers genuine ones, making it impossible to verify the literal truth of what emerges during such sessions.
In the decades since that night on Route 3 in New Hampshire, thousands of people have come forward with similar stories of missing time, strange lights in the sky, and encounters with non-human beings who subjected them to medical examinations. The phenomenon has been studied by researchers, debunked by skeptics, and remains one of the most controversial topics in ufology. Some explanations offered over the years include sleep paralysis, temporal lobe epilepsy, false memory syndrome, cultural conditioning, government psychological experiments, and of course the possibility that some experiencers are indeed encountering non-human intelligence. The truth remains elusive, locked somewhere between the certainties of skeptics who see only delusion and the convictions of experiencers who know what they felt and saw, even if they can't prove it to others. What makes the Morgan case particularly compelling is its context in early 1960s America, a time of rapid technological advancement, space race excitement, Cold War paranoia, and social upheaval. The country was looking to the stars with both hope and fear, wondering what might be out there and whether contact with other worlds would bring enlightenment or destruction. In this atmosphere, the Morgan story resonated deeply, tapping into collective anxieties about technology, the unknown, and humanity's place in a vast and possibly populated universe. Their account was detailed, consistent, and came from seemingly reliable witnesses with no apparent motive to deceive. This combination made it difficult to dismiss entirely, even for those inclined toward skepticism. The medical examinations described by Sarah and David under hypnosis have parallels in later abduction accounts, suggesting either a common experience or a common cultural script that experiencers unconsciously follow. The focus on reproductive systems, the collection of samples, the telepathic communication, and the sense of being studied by a superior intelligence became recurring themes in abduction literature. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of an ongoing program of study or even genetic manipulation of humans by extraterrestrial visitors. Others see it as reflecting deep-seated human anxieties about bodily autonomy, medical procedures, and loss of control, projected outward onto imagined alien beings. Psychological studies of abductees have found that many share certain personality traits, including high intelligence, creativity, and a tendency toward fantasy proneness, though not to pathological degrees. This has led to theories that some individuals may be more susceptible to interpreting ambiguous experiences through the lens of alien encounter, especially if they have been exposed to such narratives through media. However, this explanation struggles to account for the physical traces sometimes associated with abduction cases, such as the marks on the Morgans' car, the damage to their clothing, and the missing time that both experienced simultaneously. As we reflect on the story of Sarah and David Morgan decades later, what conclusions can we draw? The absolute truth of what happened to them on that September night in 1961 may never be known with certainty. They believed they encountered something extraordinary, something that defied their understanding of reality and left permanent marks on their psyches. Whether that something was literally extraterrestrial visitors from Zeta Reticuli, a shared psychological episode triggered by stress and unusual celestial phenomena, a genuine anomalous experience that doesn't fit neatly into either category, or something else entirely, remains an open question. What cannot be disputed is the sincerity of their account, the consistency of their testimony, and the profound impact the experience had on their lives. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and their story continues to fascinate and perplex researchers and the public alike more than 60 years later. Before we close this chapter of the Morgans' incredible journey, I want to ask you something. What do you think really happened to Sarah and David that night? Do you believe they truly encountered beings from another world, or is there another explanation that makes more sense? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, because hearing different perspectives helps us all think more deeply about these mysterious cases, and I read every single comment you leave. The Morgan case remains a cornerstone of ufology, referenced in countless books, documentaries, and academic studies of the abduction phenomenon. It demonstrated that such experiences could happen to anyone, regardless of their background or beliefs, and that the effects could be long-lasting and traumatic. It also raised important questions about memory, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself that continue to challenge researchers across multiple disciplines. As our understanding of psychology, neuroscience, and the cosmos continues to evolve, perhaps future generations will look back on cases like the Morgans with new insights that finally solve the mystery. Or perhaps the enigma will deepen as more people come forward with their own impossible stories that resist easy explanation. What remains certain is that on one September night in 1961, Sarah and David Morgan experienced something that changed them forever, something they could never fully explain or forget, something that continues to haunt the boundaries between the known and the unknown in human experience.